Yeah. Let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for the prompt, Michelle. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Scott Young, and I'm here with Michelle Gibault, and together we are the co-conveners of the DLF Privacy and Ethics in Technology Working Group. And today we are really happy to be sponsoring a webinar from the Data Doubles team. So just a couple notes on housekeeping before we get into it. The session will be recorded and it will be uploaded to the DLF YouTube channel for later viewing and sharing. So please share it. It's going to be great. During the session, drop your questions into the chat. The team has reserved about 15 minutes at the end of the hour for discussion with the presenters. So Michelle and I will be helping to moderate that chat and bring questions forward at the end. So drop all your questions there. Okay, a little intro for the Data Doubles team. So we have 4 members of the Data Doubles research team: Kyle M.L. Jones, Kristen Briney, Michael Perry, and Dorothea Sallow. Data Doubles is a IMLS-funded 3-year student-centered research project studying the student perspectives of privacy issues related to academic library participation in learning analytics. And today, the topic of their presentation is engaging student perspectives in library learning analytics. So with that, I'll pass it to Dorothea.
All right, thank you, Scott, and thank you so much to DLF for hosting us here. We really, really appreciate it. This is our outline today. The times are a little bit messed up, but don't worry about that. They're a half hour off, but whatever. I'll give you a short overview, then we will have Mike, Kristen, and Kyle respectively talking about phases 1, 2, and 3 of the research, and then we will go to Q&A. So, outcomes, we're going to tell you about our research agenda, what we're doing this for and why. We're going to show you how to keep up with us. And for the first time, you will find out about some of our high-level summary findings from phase 2 as well as phase 1 of the Data Doubles project. So an introduction to the project. Here's the team. They're wonderful, and besides the 4 of us who will actually be speaking today, several more of us are available on the chat and will be available to do some Q&A later if you are if there's anything you want to ask a specific one of us. So this all got started with most of the current team. There have been a couple of personnel shuffles working on an ARL spec kit, which you can find at arl.org. Spec Kit 360 Learning Analytics came out in September of 2018. We surveyed ARL institutions and we got some access to institutional library documentation, including some policies, some very interesting stuff. We also discovered that we work well together, and so we decided to ask IMLS for some funding. And IMLS came through. We put in a proposal, getting to know their data doubles, with a long subtitle. Funded in May 2018, $514,484. So huge thank you to IMLS, huge thank you to our program officer, James Neal, who has been absolutely wonderful throughout this. So the motivation here, there's been some research into learning analytics, a little less learning analytics in libraries, but it does exist. But there isn't much that asks students what they think, and what there is on a fairly small scale, and much of it outside the United States. Extant research suggests that the student voice is missing from a lot of these conversations. So our guiding research questions, with keeping that in mind, were how learning analytics initiatives align with and run counter to student expectations of privacy, and how might libraries maximize the benefits of learning analytics while respecting student expectations. Our goals: any learning analytics practice or technological design should be informed by the student perspective. So, goals of our research: identifying both positive and negative reactions to learning analytics practices, ascertaining privacy expectations and preferences with a demographic slant when we're able, which we're not always. And finally, to recommend policy and design changes to institutional administrators. So we've been talking about the phases. Phase 1, research team conducted preliminary interviews with students to identify themes about library participation in learning analytics and learning analytics generally with regard to privacy. This phase is complete. Phase 2, the survey's done, but the analysis is still in progress. Survey to undergraduate and graduate students at each researcher's institution. Phase 3, each team member will run a series of scenario-based focus groups with students to explore possible applications of learning analytics that both respect and break expectations of privacy, and we're still gearing up for that. And I will now, infrastructure. You can follow us at our website, datadoubles.org, and at our Twitter account, datadoubles. Our OSF toolkit, which you can find from our website, has our slide decks, preprints, research artifacts, bibliographies. We collaboratively conduct our research with shared tools, Deduce, Qualtrics, Box, Drive, Zoom. Oh, I forgot to put Zotero in there, my bad. And we're happy to talk about our tool set and how we make things work because we are geographically widely dispersed. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Thanks so much, Dorothea. So my name is Michael Perry. I'm the head of assessment and planning at Northwestern University, and I'm going to talk to you about phase 1 of our research project, which was those semi-structured interviews that we mentioned in the overview of the whole project. So as we sat down thinking about how we were going to conduct this research, we arrived pretty quickly on the idea that the first thing we wanted to do was sit down and talk actually with individual students to begin to understand what their perceptions were, so that we could inform how we built all those tools in the subsequent phases. So the purpose of this phase was to conduct some semi-structured interviews with undergraduate students at each of our sites, and I'll run you through all of those in a moment. So the goal of this was to really start to have a conversation with students and understand their reactions to data mining and analytics practices, both widely, right, even in the commercial sphere, but then how those things manifest in higher education, and then specifically how they did in libraries as well. So we've been talking about these because they've been done for some time now at a whole number of presentations. All the slide decks from those are up at OSF. And there have also been 2 publications from the findings of this one. One from our presentation and then the associated paper in the proceedings from the ACRL conference in 2019. And then a forthcoming article that should be out very soon in the Journal of the Association for Information Science and Technology, which will outline some of the more rigorous data applications that we went through and analysis that was done as part of these. So my goal will just be really to give you a slight taste of how we conducted these interviews and some of the top level findings that we found. But again, if there are specific things that you have, please include questions in the chat and we'll get to those towards the end. So you can advance it. So the goal was across the 8 institutions that we were working with, which you can see listed here, to have our researchers conduct 15 interviews at each site. That put us at a grand total of 120 interviews, and we ended up with 105 valid ones after we reviewed the completed interviews to make sure that they met the standards that we had set forward, and then after we managed everything. So the interview protocols that the researchers conducted each began with 3 core questions that covered what I talked about earlier. How people felt about privacy sort of generally in relation to higher education, and then specifically in relation to libraries. So every researcher asked those questions of the students, and we use that as the kind of baseline that we were looking at. We then developed 5 individual modules. Each researcher conducted 3 interviews for each module, so we should have 3 sets of those across each of the institutions. One was a more robust one that covered a little bit more deeper concepts around privacy and how students felt about that. One explicitly talked about data sharing and use, where students were comfortable with data sharing or where there might be discomfort around those things. Data protections, what things students thought should be done to protect their data or what things they themselves do to protect their data. Awareness of and reactions to learning analytics. So how aware are students about these trends that we see emerging across the landscape of higher education? And how do they feel about these new initiatives? And then the final one dealt specifically with libraries and their relationship with learning analytics initiatives and how students felt about those interactions. Once we had completed all of those interviews, which took quite a bit of time, we went ahead and created case summaries for each of the interviews that were done to kind of give us just a quick one-sheet summary of what the themes that were pulled out of those individual interviews were. We used that in the development of our codebook for analyzing all of the results, which ultimately ended up having 79 codes that were grouped into 7 thematic areas. The team then broke up and coded all of our 105 5 interviews, applying somewhere around 11,000 codes in Deduce. That we had that many people working simultaneously coding interviews in and of itself is something I am profoundly proud of. So I'd just like to commend my colleagues for that one. So after we did all of that work, what is it that we found? So I'm going to share with you 5 of the kind of highest of high level summary findings here. The first, and one that I don't think will surprise anyone, there were definitely literacy issues when it came to specifically areas around data and privacy literacy. Students really weren't able to articulate preferences and how those preferences related to data practices that higher education, or even really the general world, was engaged in. There was just a lot of gaps there, so they were left sort of speculating about those missing pieces. Which led into the second key finding was the speculative benefits. The lack of understanding of those data and privacy literacies or frameworks to think about those things often led students to speculate about why someone would be doing these things or why the institution would, and then to fill in, well, if they were choosing to do this, there must be some benefit. So they began to then formulate what they thought that was. We saw some really interesting things, especially in relation to the libraries here, because often students jumped on, well, I think it's okay for the library to track things because you need to know what I'm using so that you can buy all of the right stuff. Which on its face seems like a very logical through line, right, that students jumped on. But once you really start to think about that, well, the students have basically articulating the difference between personally identifiable information and aggregated data and de-identified aggregated data there, right? And doing something like seeing if we are buying the right stuff does not necessarily need to have that individual that is using it tied to it. One of the next findings, and one of the ones that I think I found personally to be the most, I want to say, motivating in this work, students expressed really nuanced arguments about when data access should be restricted. At first, you might think this flies in the face of them not really having those frameworks to think about these things. But really how this manifested was especially when they said, well, I don't think I have a problem with that, but I can understand why one of my peers would. And I especially understand why one of my peers in a perhaps traditionally underrepresented community definitely might feel different from this. So it's really interesting and something that we're seeing some bits of in the survey data as well, but that students think about privacy not only in relation to their individual beings, but often in relation to their peers and how their peers might interact with these systems as well. The next big finding, informed consent. After identifying the gaps of those knowledge about learning analytics and institutional data practices, students really then began to probe where those gaps exist or why. And often the outcome they came to was someone must be willfully really keeping this information from us, right? Or the institution isn't really going out of its way to explain it to us, right? And that let them again sort of try to look for a reason why the institution might be using this, but then without having any information to fill that in, right, what you're going to assume is that it's probably not being done always in my individual best interest, which was also something that they often found, was that they wanted to know not how a learning analytics initiative would benefit the university as a whole, which is how we often hear these talked about, but what will it do for me as an individual? And that's something else that we often lose sight of. The final big finding that we found, and one in which I think requires the most probing, both from us as researchers, but I challenge every practitioner here to really think about as well, is an issue of trust. Students clearly differentiated degrees of trust. This was especially true when we asked about corporate entities and in a rather extreme sense of distrust to them. That lessened greatly when we talked about institutions of higher education. And usually then their nonprofit status got brought into play. And they thought about, well, this is an entity that exists for the good or my individual good. So they're going to do things that benefit me. When we zero that in a little bit more into the library, that trust off the charts, really. You coupled with that the inherited notion that libraries, especially academic research libraries, get from their parent institution being this nonprofit that is viewed well, and layer onto that the vocational awe that librarians themselves benefit from. And you found that almost everyone wanted to assume the best out of their libraries, right? Figured that any tracking or things that they were doing was to benefit the library and ensure that the library could do more of what it was that was helping them out during their educational career. So really, a thing that I want to challenge all of our practitioners out there to think about is, are we really truly honoring that trust with our students when we engage in these initiatives? And are we being transparent with them so that they can create those frameworks that understand the data processes that are going on in the background and the ways in which their data might be shared within the library and then outside the library as well? So with that, I think that's the high level findings from the interviews that we used to begin developing the survey. And I'll hand it over to Kristen to talk about that.
Thank you, Michael. I'm very excited to talk to you all today about our phase 2 results. I'm Kristen Briney. I am the biology librarian at Caltech. So to follow up on our phase 1 results, it was really logical to do a large survey of a number of students, as many students as we could really get, to kind of bridge those themes from phase 1 and kind of do a blanket. What's going on? What do students feel? What can we actually say broadly about students and how they feel about the library use of their personal data for learning analytics? So the phase 1 complete. Phase 2 is actually in process, and we are currently writing them up. So I won't have exact final data to show you today, but I have data, and it's really exciting because we were going to share this data at a lot of different conferences, and then COVID happened. And so congratulations, you guys are the first to actually see this data in public. And that's why I'm super excited. I'm like, let me take phase 2. I want to share the phase 2 data. I'm super excited about it. So the survey itself, really, when we had the themes in phase 1, we had to kind of break them up into individual, like you only got exposed to one theme of the interviews. But because of the survey design, we could really send students all sorts of different thematic modules in one go. So we kind of had a very large survey. We nominally say it was 25 questions, but all those questions had subparts. Actually, almost all those questions, some have subparts. So we ended up with 154 unique responses. So we're sitting on quite a lot of data to analyze. Within those questions, we have, again, different themes, and some of them you will have seen either in the themes from phase 1 or from some of the results that Mike just talked about. So the 7 major themes, thematic modules that we asked about were general knowledge about learning analytics, what they thought about data sharing and use, what students thought about data access and limits, what students thought about data rights, consent, privacy, and trust. And not included in this list is demographics. We didn't actually ask demographics in phase 1. That was actually a deliberate choice because we're privacy researchers. So we wanted to ask them a little less information than we necessarily could have. So we wanted to protect their privacy. But with the survey, the demographics are actually important. So we really built that in and thought about how to navigate that. So we also have demographic information. So once we built this survey, we have done a lot of things to make sure that it is robust. And so we did some survey validation. So we did, let me see if I can explain all this clearly. So we did content validation to make sure that the questions were actually asking what we thought that they were asking. So comprehension, making sure that our key terms were defined and that we had experts look over all of this and make sure that we were putting together a good survey. We also conducted in-depth cognitive interviews with undergraduate students to kind of think aloud through the survey to make sure that they were interpreting the survey in the way that we anticipated so they would answer the questions correctly. And then finally, we pilot tested the survey at Northwestern to make sure that we could work out any kinks with rolling the survey out and making sure that we had some test data to do a little bit more validation on. So we distributed the full survey via Qualtrics. We did 8 institutions and we had a slight change. I believe we had Brooklyn College was in and Oregon State was out, but otherwise it's pretty much the same student populations that we studied in phase 1. We obtained a number of student lists, somewhere between 3,500 and 5,000 from each institution, either by requesting it from the institutional research office or an open records request, depending on the institution. So each institution, we sent out about 35 to 5,000 surveys. We got back just over, let's see, 2,300 that we considered complete. So we included students that had completed the survey, students that had partially completed the survey but never hit that official end point, because Qualtrics can tell. And then for those partial responses, we asked students to complete at least a module or that many questions as the first module. We had about a 6% return rate, and congratulations, Northwestern, you all are overachievers. You guys thank you, Michael. You filled out lots of surveys, which we appreciate. So we had 1,900 fully completed surveys. We did a lot of statistical analysis to make sure that we can say the validity of the results, whether things are significant or not. If you have questions about this, I am not the person to ask. Andrew Asher is our survey statistics wizard. So thank you, but if you have questions, please ask him. I will try to do my best to summarize the amazing work that he has done. So let's see. So we have the completed surveys. We have a maximum relative standard error of 2.3%. So we feel pretty comfortable having a big enough sample size to draw some conclusions. We also tested the reliability of those themes to make sure that if people answered like they really want privacy, that across the theme, those answers were fairly statistic, and we looked at the statistical omega value, and that was over 0.8 as expected. We also compared student responses between institutions, which is really important, and thankfully there wasn't a statistically meaningful difference between institution affiliation, which makes our data analysis cleaner, but also is an interesting finding in and of itself that the institutions that we were surveying were roughly the same in terms of how students were answering. Within the demographics, we have chi-square tests, and for things that were significant, we ran the Kramer's V statistic to actually tell, if it is statistic, how big of an effect is it? I'm not going to go into those exact statistical results today. We'll publish them and you can read more. So we have a lot of data. I'm not going to be able to cover it. I'm going to cover kind of what we started with. So this is kind of our first paper that we're working up, and we're really focusing on 3 research questions. We're not actually even going to get to the 3rd research question today, which is demographics, because demographics is a giant rabbit hole that we're still, I think we've got some of the kinks worked out, but there's plenty of data for research questions 1 and 2 to talk about today. So research question 1, go back, Dorothea. I want to read those. Thank you. What are students' expectation of privacy surrounding their access of the physical library space, physical library resources, and online library resources? So what do they expect? And number 2, following up on our finding from phase 1, what levels of trust do students report about librarian access to data? Thank you. We also have some background data that I'm going to show you that aren't related to those research questions. You can go ahead now, Dorothea. Thank you. These are the green figures. So for background information, we thought it's important to talk generally about how students feel about privacy broadly. And as privacy researchers, I like to see this chart because that dark green is yes, the light green is no, and that gray is unsure. And it means this chart means that students believe that privacy is important to them. So we asked them, is privacy important to you? And gave them a bunch of different choices which they could say yes, no, or unsure. So for example, 94% of students said, yes, privacy is important to protect myself against intrusions in my life. The smallest yes value was to develop relationships with other people, but that is still 68%. So we're seeing quite a lot of students saying, for a number of reasons, that privacy is important to them to develop their identity no matter what. I like seeing that. The 80% say no matter what, privacy is important. And finally, a high level to develop intellectual ideas. So base level privacy is important. Getting further into general understanding of students' privacy around libraries in particular, we asked them about university libraries. So we asked them, my university's library can give my personally identifiable information to a number of these offices. Again, dark green is yes, light green is no, and gray is unsure. And what I really want to talk about, highlight here, is how many unsure students are out there. And again, this is reinforcing the findings from phase one. They don't really know what's going on. So at least a third of students that we asked, what do you think your library is doing? They said, I don't know. Within the students who answered yes or no, students generally believe that we are giving, can give their personally identifiable information to other university offices. Generally don't believe, on the other end, the bottom of that figure, that we can give their personally identifiable information to outside businesses. So generally within the university, a lot of students believe that data does flow. But again, we have high numbers of unsure students. I want to actually do a footnote here, a verbal footnote, that we didn't actually correlate these responses to what was actually happening in individual institutions to say whether or not the library was actually sharing data with those particular offices. That's would be a very interesting thing to look into going forward, but that we haven't done that. So the previous question said, ask students what they think the library, who they think the library can give data to. This question asks we ask students, your university library uses your personal identifiable information to do X. Again, lots of sub-questions. We have lots of data. We have dark green is yes. Again, we have a large number of unsure students. Students generally, about a third of students don't actually know what we do with their personally identifiable information. The most students answered, about 65%, that we as libraries use their personally identifiable information to identify books, journals, and other things that they use. On the bottom, these are all ranked from most yeses to least yeses. On the bottom, we have only 21% of students thinking that we identify where they go within the library. We also ask them to identify the services that they use. 60% say we use that information. To recommend books, journals, and other things, 45% of students say we use their PII to do that. And 44% of students think that we identify the websites that they visit while they're in the library. So it's really interesting to see kind of that breakdown. All right, so now we get into, that was just background information. Now we're getting into research question one, which is basically what students' expectations are around data use. So we asked them, how comfortable are you with your university collecting different types of personally identifiable information about you? And we asked them about both physical library resources and online library resources. So the dark blue at the left is that they were very uncomfortable with the university collecting this information, and the light blue on the right is that they were very comfortable collecting this information. So we have very uncomfortable, uncomfortable, comfortable, and very comfortable from dark blue to light blue. So that's how you're interpreting this figure. What's interesting, the top bar is physical library resources, the bottom bar is online library resources. There really wasn't a big difference between the two types among students, and students were generally comfortable with us collecting that type of information, but still almost 20% students said that they were uncomfortable or very uncomfortable with the university library, or the university, sorry, collecting this type of personally identifiable information. Okay, this is my absolute favorite figure. So let's talk about this one because it's good. So we asked, this is research question 2 now, it's color-coded orange. I would feel my privacy was violated if librarians did the following. So yes is dark orange, no is light orange, and again, gray is unsure. So we asked them for a number of actions dealing with student data, how students would feel if they felt their privacy was violated. So 70% of our students feel that their privacy would be violated if librarians had access to their personally identifiable information. So students feel very strongly about personally identifiable information, and the majority of them don't want librarians accessing that information. When it comes to de-identified information, which is the second and third lines, they feel a little bit more comfortable. So we asked them if their privacy would be violated if we share de-identified information within the university, and 21% said yes, and share de-identified information outside of the university, and 38% said yes. So there's obviously a clear distinction here between personally identifiable information, that is, this is you, this is your information, and de-identified information, which strips out some of the personal identifiers and say, generally, the students are doing X. And within that, students are much more comfortable, or more comfortable to have that data remain within the university than to have it shared outside the university. And again, the last 2 lines, we see those trends reinforced. We asked students if their privacy would be violated if librarians, remember, shared their personally identifiable information within their university and shared their personally identifiable information outside of the university. 75% did not want librarians to share their personally identifiable information within the university. And a whopping 92% said, you better not send my personally identifiable information outside of this university, thank you very much. So I think this is my favorite chart that I got to work on. It really shows very clearly, maybe not very clearly, but really starts showing some of the lines of what students think is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And there's very clear distinctions between in university sharing and outside of university sharing, as well as the difference between personally identifiable information and de-identified information. Students are most comfortable if we're dealing with de-identified information about them. To continue on another theme that we saw in phase 1, we asked them about trust. And we asked if, there's 2 different questions here. So the top bar is, do you trust librarians not to misuse personally identifiable information about you? The bottom bar is, do you trust your university library to use your personally identifiable information in ways that respect your trust? So the top bar is asking about librarians, and the bottom bar is asking about libraries broadly. You can kind of see that they are fairly similar. The library and the librarians are roughly appear to be equivalent in students' mind. So a number of students, the majority of students trust us somewhat. There are about 16% of students don't trust us at all. And a number of students, about that same number, trust us completely. What's interesting in the data we're not showing is we actually compared this to different types of university workers, and librarians are not doing that. Wait, is this the data we compared against different workers? So I'm getting confused. I should just not mention that. Librarian trust was not great. I believe it was with access. They didn't want librarians accessing, and they were, just forget I said anything. We're still working up the results. I'm working on it. Too much data. All right. Do we have one more figure? No. Okay, so that is what we've got phase 2. We're ending on a confused note because we're not done with this. We will have more results. We will particularly have more demographic results in the future. We're just sitting on a lot of data, and we'll get it written up and out in the world, and I'm just excited to share with you all.
Thanks, Kristen. Hi, everybody. I'm Kyle Jones. I'm an assistant professor at Indiana University, Indianapolis, in the School of Informatics and Computing in the Department of Library and Information Science. I just want to re-emphasize the amount of data we are sitting on, both in phase 2, but also still in phase 1. For anybody who has done qualitative analysis of interviews, to have 105 valid interviews is a lot of transcript data to go through. So there's still a lot of opportunity, but we are only so many people with so much time and so much resources. So hopefully we'll be able to get back to that. But we have our initial papers that we have to get to first. I just want to say thanks a lot to Kristen and Andrew, who have really shepherded the phase 2 analysis. That has been immensely helpful and has provided great insights to people more qualitatively minded like myself. So we're a very well-rounded team in that regard. So I'm going to talk about phase 3. So phase 3 is all about scenario-based focus groups, which may sound familiar to you, but we're doing a little bit of a spin on it, and I want to give you some insights into regarding why we are doing this, where the method comes from, what we think the outcomes possibly will be, and also some changes we've had to make in this pandemic world that we all live in. So the focus is on doing scenario-based focus groups, again, with undergraduates. That's been our sample, or our population, I should say, throughout all phases. We focused in on undergraduate students. We will continue to do so in this third and final phase. And what we're trying to do here with these scenario-based focus groups is present students with a scenario, a particular socio-technical application of a learning analytics practice in an academic library. And this practice can be something that is in the near term in terms of what we think we can expect to actually be implemented in an academic library, something a little farther off, and something a little bit more far off past that. So in some ways, it's a form of practical science fiction, is what we're doing in these scenario-based focus groups. It's rooted in the literature, but using our understanding of the methods, of the politics, of the interests related to learning analytics, and constructing these scenarios that students will interact with. So where we are with this phase? Well, we're still finishing up phase 2, so we're not very far into phase 3. We'll say that we've done the literature gathering, and we have an expert on our advisory board. He was chosen, or invited, I should say, to join our advisory board because of his expertise in this area, and he has started to provide some guidance on how to work with this method. And I'll say a little bit about the method and him right now. Good timing, Dorothea. So scenario-based focus groups. The version of these focus groups that we are applying in this phase come from a number of faculty at Arizona State University's School for the Information of Innovation and Society, which I think is just an awesome school name. Sounds very, very, very much like a fun place to be. And these faculty have used this method for a variety of purposes, none of which relate to higher education or academic libraries. And I'll talk about why that's unique here in a little bit. But what they have done is they've applied this method, and this is getting down to that last bullet point, to look at nanotechnology, to look at the environmental sustainability design of cities. The one thing that I found interesting is that they did agenda setting for NASA. So NASA came to them and they said, hey, we're interested in mining asteroids, right? You go back to the public and get some information from them about how they feel about a couple of different scenarios about mining asteroids. And one of the scenarios was getting actual material from the asteroids and understanding what the benefits and the costs and other results may be from that. Another scenario was, making sure the asteroids or meteors, whatever they were, I'm not very good with my space artifacts, making sure that they don't hit the Earth. So what do you want? Do you want to, mine these, or do you want to make sure that the Earth doesn't explode when they hit it? And so they use that information, They went and had the scenario-based focus groups and then took it back to NASA, and NASA changed their agenda in terms of how they were going to approach this and how they were going to interact with the public. And it's that interaction, nope, go back one second. It's that interaction with the public that I think is very, very important here. So the whole purpose of these scenarios is to integrate a lot of stakeholder perspectives, talk about the politics, talk about the power, talk about the interest that's involved, relate it to the technological design, and get these perspectives out of these scenario-based focus groups to actually inform action, to actually inform policy development, to actually inform technological design. And I think that's something that we don't see in the learning analytics literature broadly right now. We're doing, I mean, phases 1 and 2 are really useful, right? Because it raises the perspectives and the preferences related to student privacy, but it doesn't actually get students to interact with a particular socio-technical design. And this is where the focus groups start to do that and start to actually get them to be much more aware of a particular practice and to relate those preferences and expectations to something that is a little bit more tangible. I mean, right now, when we talk about these interviews and these surveys, it's not that it's not tangible, but it's abstract, right? Because there's a lack of awareness, there's a lack of literacy. And so when we put them in a situation where they have to interact with the scenario, we think we're going to get some really interesting information in terms of perhaps more specific preferences and expectations, and to do something that is very useful for administrators, technological designers, librarians, et cetera. Okay, now next slide there. So how did we intend to run these scenario-based focus groups? Well, in the beautiful world that we knew back in late 2017, early 2018, when we wrote the proposal, you know, everybody was healthy and we could do these things face-to-face. Right now, we are not in that situation. And so we are changing our method from a face-to-face to a virtual experience. In Zoom is how we're going to do this. And that was concerning to all of us, right? Because the scenario-based focus groups have been done face-to-face in a lot of other settings. To do them now in Zoom made us wonder, A, is this even possible? B, do we need to change our outcomes? And, you know, talk to James Neal and IMLS about changing, you know, the design of the study. And, you know, C, what kind of data can we expect to actually get out of this situation? Will it be, you know, of less quality, et cetera? What we did is we had this actually it was a multiple meeting conversation about the ethics of doing this research in a pandemic, and decided that it would be best to continue down this route, given input from our advisory board, which we got, and to also delay running the focus groups until late November, early February. And we just had a meeting yesterday about when exactly we're going to do this. It looks like we're going to start our focus groups in probably late January, early February. And the whole point of this is that all of our students, and let's be frank here, all of the researchers in this beautiful array of webcams here that are on the team are all transitioning into a new higher education experience in the fall. We'll have new workflows, we'll have different types of relationships with people in terms of how we interact and communicate, and it's gonna be the same for our students. And so to try to go to our students and say, hey, you wanna participate in this research in the second week of your new online semester where you have no idea really what's going on, we didn't think that that was the best choice to make. And so that's why we're delaying things until February. Now, with regard to the efficacy of this method in an online experience, and in talking with Ira Bennett, who is our advisory board member, we actually think it presents a lot of interesting opportunities in terms of data collection. So, you know, when you do a face-to-face experience for these scenario-based focus groups, you have note takers on the research team, you have facilitators who actually run the scenario-based focus group, and you have, you know, logistical managers in terms of getting people, you know, to the focus groups to participate, et cetera. Those roles transfer into the online environment, but because it's online, it gives us an opportunity to record pretty much every single interaction that students have with each other and with all the people on the research team, but also to interact with different artifacts that we can share via Zoom and collectively get people's eyes on that. So we can jump from a website to a Google Doc, et cetera, and all record that and make it analyzable. So we think that there's a lot more opportunity there, but it is going to take a little bit more energy on the part of the research team to actually conduct the focus groups. So it's kind of where we're at with that. So now we'll hand it over to our wonderful DLF moderators.
Okay, hi, welcome back everyone. Scott Young here again. Thanks again to the Data Doubles team, Kyle, Dorothea, Michael, and Kristen, and the entire research group. And also bravo on nailing your time, your outline exactly right. So we have 15 minutes. The chat has been great. There's a couple questions that we want to pull out. There's a comment from Sarah Hartman Caverly. She said, thank you for debunking the students do not care about privacy hoax. So that got us thinking about the metaphor of the data double and how that metaphor is so compelling and so intriguing, and how your project helps us understand that we, first of all, have a data double, and that second, how and why we should be able to better control our data double. And then, in fact, that students do care about it. So thinking about public communication of your findings, reaching out to library and university administration, where do you go with outreach and public communication, and how can we help get your message out too?
I mean, just quickly, one of the things that I will say is that if you look at the grant proposal, you'll see that the outputs of this research is really focused on practitioners, right? We want to get the results in front of many of you who are in this wonderful webinar provided by DLF, many of you who will go back to your teams, who will go back to your administrators, who will go back to your colleagues, and hopefully, disseminate the research further and interpret the research in the context of your institutions and of your priorities and of your needs. I appreciate, and I do science for science's sake sometimes, but I think that it's very important with this type of research to make it intelligible, to make it actionable, and to help people who are actually on the ground struggling with how to address student privacy actually be able to use the findings in a particular way. So that's always been the intention of the project.
I think the other thing is, I say this as somebody who's really interested in open, is that we want to make a lot of these processes and materials open so you can apply them at your own institution. So the idea is, yes, we're doing this big survey to ask students what they think, but we don't have, that's not something that only we can do. Go out and ask your students what they think. We want to model the possibility.
I think that's one of the biggest things for me. And then always reminding yourself in the normal day-to-days of your job, when things around data or workflows, or especially like student data flows come up, to think about some of these questions and think about their perspectives and bring it up, right? We're talking about now what reopening for the fall looks like and what reservable study space looks like. And what have we done? We've created an entire new data stream of data about how students are interacting with the library, much more rigidly tracking where they are within it, which we've seen as bright lines in some of our research, especially physical location tracking. Right, so those are conversations that we need to have, even at this moment when it's really difficult to, because we're all struggling to try to just make it to next week. But we do need to bring up those things and think about those things, especially as we are adapting to this more digitally first world.
Adding on to what Mike just said, I think in a lot of campuses, mine not least, the data governance around a lot of this data is at a very, how do I say this politely, introductory, I guess I'll say, stage. And the more that our work on the student voice helps these processes include student voices, either through us or by, oh gosh, that would be a good thing to do, let's get student government involved or whatever, we definitely think that's a good thing.
And it could be an interesting way to engage new student partners. Right before, one of the last things I got to do before everything closed down was meet with an open data group. It was a student-founded, completely student-run group that was looking at opening up data about ways in which, especially my university, interacted with the surrounding community. Right. So I found out about that and sat down and talked with them, and then it was amazing. And we'll see what comes out of it now, because priorities, right? But there's all sorts of new opportunities for interacting with students and bringing them in new engaging ways.
So I'm just going to read Lisa's question in the chat. Will your scenarios probe to the would it be better to not offer the service if we can't do it without tracking? For example, an extreme example, if the state law requires contact tracing, better to not open the library. More realistic, should we cancel databases that do tracking?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. And to be completely honest, we haven't written the scenarios yet. And so no, we don't know if we're asking that question. But to spread it out a little further, the point of the scenarios is to probe a wide spectrum of preference, right? So, you know, the structure will allow for such a question where it will get students to say, you know, what do you think about this practice? Is it okay if we do X? Should we do Y? What would happen if we did Y? What would happen if we did X? What would happen if the goals or the outcomes changed, if we went a particular way in this scenario? And so the scenarios will not force students into accepting a particular way of doing learning analytics in the library. And in fact, that would be completely antithetical to the whole purpose of the scenarios, of the method. It's to get their voice to be brought to the table and to interpret a particular situation and to allow for perhaps a perspective that maybe some of the audience wouldn't want to see brought up. You know, it's really whatever the students have to say. But this is why it's important for these scenarios to be highly structured, right? Is that we need to ask those specific questions, almost like a choose your own adventure story, right? Like each part of the scenario, we give them a new iteration on a question to work them through a different pathway. And one of those pathways may be, you know, don't do this. What would happen if we didn't do this? But, you know, the outcomes are different.
One other thing to tack on to what Kyle said, that while it's not covered in what we're looking to do with the focus groups, because we're looking at one specific group, there's a lot of issues around that, and especially the tracking versus access and usage that I think would be really interesting to understand faculty perceptions of. Right, we're not touching that, but that's a whole nother group of individuals who are going to have opinions and thoughts about those things as well, and ripe for another opportunity for other folks to engage in this research.
Let me throw a question from Sarah Hartman Caverly out there, because I think well, obviously it's a good one. Did the magic wand known as FERPA come up in your findings at all? Wondering if students share the seemingly ubiquitous professional stance that FERPA compliance is sufficient for respect for privacy.
I can't recall the acronym FERPA ever being mentioned by any of our students in the interviews. Right. I mean, I have my own opinions. I've written about them and my own criticisms of FERPA. But I can't recall students ever bringing that up. And perhaps that's a problem, right? You know, one of the parts of privacy literacy is knowing what policies and laws are protecting you and what your rights are with regard to those laws and those policies. And if you don't know that the policy exists, if you don't know that the law exists, then you can't express your rights in a particular way. So perhaps it's concerning that students never brought up FERPA. Putting aside the magic wand comment, and I agree with that. It's something that, you know, I think if we straight up ask them, do you know you have rights under the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974? Probably 99% of them would say, I've never heard of that. Please tell me more.
I feel like Abigail recalls one, and I think I do too, out of the interviews. And I think it was because I think it was one I conducted, if I'm remembering it correctly, so don't quote me. But that was an international student who had one of the most robust understandings of privacy that I think I encountered in all of this, and was from a country who will just say has a history of maybe some not great things around ubiquitous surveillance. So you could tell that they had a profoundly educated, and one of the first things that they did when they came to this country was learn laws around this stuff. So that was so far the exception from all of this. But I think just demonstrates that these things do have real world consequences and really do deeply matter to people, especially those in different situations.
I remember no student in any of my interviews mentioning FERPA.
All right, we have a question from up a ways in the chat from Justin White when you were discussing your phase 1 results. So also a question about what students understand. Justin commented that it's interesting to note how all of the tech systems are interconnected on campus, and even the library itself might not know how everything is connected and how data is shared. There might be some people on campus. So Justin said that he doubts that students understand that distinction as well. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's when we talk about the literacy thing, there's that base level understanding frameworks in which you can conceptualize privacy and how that interacts with your life, which is a kind of higher order thing. And then you have the real like boots on the ground, right? How do these systems interconnect? And I spent a brief period of time as a systems librarian. Shout out to all of those people. The number of systems that you have to run through when you think about, say, I want to find a research article, to actually getting that article to when you read it could be upwards of 5 to 7 systems, depending on layouts of things, all of which may be independent vendors, maybe all different vendors, right? And data may be flowing in between all of those. So it's almost impossible to expect librarians who are not explicitly systems focused to really understand those deep interactions between those things. And on top of that, shout out to my access services people who go out of their way to ensure a seamless experience to students, because that's important, right? That's crucial, and we work so hard to do that. So we're kind of simultaneously hiding all of that so that they don't have to engage with it or really think about the various systems that they're running through as they're performing these tasks, because we want to make it as seamless and easy and as flow through for them as possible. But then really not doing anything to also talk about that to people, or give them, for those people who are deeply interested in like, how does this actually work, an avenue for really asking those questions or engaging in those dialogues. And there's a lot there to even unpack about when you're talking about open source systems versus vendor systems and all of those things as well.
All right, question from Steve McCann. To what extent were students aware of the value they were either accepting or giving up via their preferences for library privacy? I'm thinking specifically for NYU Learning's conception of learning analytics as a sense-making activity for students.
I'm not sure students necessarily know the value, because one of the findings was they don't necessarily understand what we're doing. And I think that they, especially from phase 1, we saw that, well, if they're doing it, it must be for our benefit, right? They trust us, but I don't know if we are necessarily engaging with them to show them the value of what we're doing.
There's also a question there, and Kyle has definitely done a lot of work on this. Value to whom? Value to them as students? Value to the library? Value to the institution? These are not all the same thing.
Yeah, I was just thinking back to the interviews. I think students could generally identify an educational benefit, and there was an assumption there that that benefit would redound to them at the individual level. I think that there is a lot of unpacking to do about what an educational benefit is, and that gets to your point, Dorothea, is, who within the institution actually benefits from the things that learning analytics practitioners generally are doing, or library learning analytics practitioners are doing specifically. I think this is where the trust comes into play, because there is a higher degree of trust, both, or at least there was identified in the interviews, a higher degree of trust in libraries and the institutions, that perhaps that doesn't motivate the nuanced questioning of what that benefit issue or that value issue looks like, and what the nuances are of, when those benefits are acceptable or those harms are potentially acceptable with a given practice. And perhaps that's what the scenarios will really probe into.
And I know in an odd interpretation of value, and a very economic-based one, a closing out question in a lot of my interviews, a lot of students wanted to know, is the university doing stuff like this? And I hope they're not. And then especially the selling of data often came up as is that a thing that happens? Because if not, please don't do that. I'd almost rather pay more in tuition than have you do that. Which I think does speak to the fact that there is some value thinking going on there, but I think you're hitting some of those roadblocks about you don't have the framework to fully think through what they are. And I don't think most people have the frameworks to really assess a value to personally identifiable information for them in a purely capitalist sense.
Yeah, the sale of data point was a very bright red line when we looked at the interview data. Very vocal. And it's interesting because I know in the interviews that when we talked about e-commerce and we talked about social media, they were aware that those institutions were making money off of their data. They're not so much aware of the technological or the vendor contracts, I should say, that we have, that institutions have, and the degree to which those vendors do actually reap value, financial and otherwise, from student data. And even though data sales there's not an A to B straight comparison between what, say, Twitter does and what, say, my institution does, there is money being made off of student data, just in perhaps a roundabout or in an obvious way there. So again, this is kind of an epistemological issue with students, is that they don't understand or don't have the questions to understand how that student data may be sold in a non-traditional sense.
It is top of the hour, so I just wanted to give another shout out to IMLS, without whom this would not have been possible. So thank you, IMLS.
All right, thank you, Dorothea, and thank you to the whole Data Devils team again. You're asking so many good questions and finding so many good answers. We'll continue to tune in to see your phase 3 results, your phase 2 and phase 3 results, and we'll watch for your practical resources that we can all put into action in our local contexts. So thanks again to everyone for attending today. This session will be available on the DLF YouTube channel, so you can view it again, share with your colleagues. So with that, we'll just say, have a great day, everyone. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, DLF.
Thanks, everybody.